Hi guys, welcome to episode 9. Today I just want to talk to you a little bit about Final Fantasy X, if I can get rid of the glare there, and Final Fantasy X-2, and just talk to you a little bit about my memories and my first impressions with the games, and what my feelings are years later after their release. Final Fantasy X, if you don't know, was released in 2001 and 2002, depending on where you live, for the PlayStation 2 by Squaresoft. And it was the first Final Fantasy to be on a new next-gen, 6th-gen system. It was the first fully 3D Final Fantasy. It was the first Final Fantasy to have full voiceovers. There's a lot of firsts for the series, and some people consider it to be the last great true Final Fantasy, and even if it's not the last one that you liked, it's one of the last ones done in the old style that was part of the main series and not a spin-off. I was incredibly excited to get Final Fantasy X-2. It was something I was really looking forward to. I had just gotten my PS2 less than a year earlier. I was a huge Final Fantasy fan. I remember I got it for Christmas that year from my grandmother. We're going down to Delaware, getting it for Christmas, having to wait the whole trip back, and then couldn't play it that night because it was like 9, 10 o'clock at night, maybe even later by the time I got home. Next day, probably played it the entire day. Absolutely loved it. The voiceovers were a little bit of a mixed bag. For the first time, it was really, really good. I wasn't quite sure at first how much I liked Titus, the main character, but I really grew to love him, and my sort of reservations at first were they were almost a good thing, because to explain, the main character here, you can kind of see him on the cover, is different than in most Final Fantasies prior. Typically, it was more of that very stoic, warrior type. Think of, a lot of people who played 7, think of Cloud, think of Squall, think of, even to go back to like 5 and 4 and the older ones. And he was very different. He was arrogant, he was whiny, he was, just this really, he was a famous athlete in his time thrown into this new world that he found out his way in his future, and he grew as a character more, I think, because of his beginnings, because he was not a very likable character in the first few hours of the game. He actually became a better character throughout the course of the game because you saw a greater change and a more realistic change, and it was a good perspective. It was a different perspective of that weaker character. You didn't feel like the main character was this strong leader. You felt like the main character was someone who was lost and a little bit weak and relying on others to survive and growing into himself and becoming the hero by the end of the story. And also give it a chance, even though it's narrated by Titus and it's told through his perspective, the fact that he relies so much on others, it kind of gives it less of a clear-cut, this is the main character, even though it very is from a storytelling perspective. It's more his story and Yuna's story together. The female protagonist, which you can kind of see on the back here, the summoner Yuna, I absolutely love her. Amazing game. I love the fighting system. As far as classic fighting systems, is my favorite of all time. You had the typical 3 characters out at once in battle, and typical, standard turn-based, but what was new, what they added was you can switch characters on the fly in battle, and just keep back and forth, and that way all characters could participate in once, so you can really have good strategies, and it really let you utilize everyone in more complex strategies than if you're limited just 3 or 4 people. The spear grid system was great. The new way of leveling, you had basic levels with basic, little increases to HP and your MP and whatever, like little stat increases every time you leveled up. But the main thing was the sphere grid, where each character would start towards like one end of this giant web of abilities, and they would all start at different corners, and the corners they would start in were more towards their basic character types. Like Lulu, the Dark Mage, would start more towards black magic, and Yuna would start more towards white magic and summons, and Auron would be amongst all these abilities that he'd have a lot of more health boosts, more about strength, more about stamina, and Titus would be more towards speed and agility. But as you got closer to the middle, you were able to branch out more and more until, if you really felt like spending well over 100 hours in the game, you could technically have everyone get every single sphere by the end of the game. But normally what you'll do is you'll have these very sort of entrenched character types, and then as they grow, as you get later into the game, Titus might learn a handful of black magic spells or a handful of white magic spells to sort of give everyone a little bit more rounded, but they're still only going to be the best in their specific area. And, so it's a great leveling system. I loved it. Story was fantastic. The colors, I love the color palette for this. You can kind of see a little bit of just a little bit of the cover. It's a little bit brighter than a lot of Final Fantasies. It uses, it's a lot of the art comes from Okinawa. They used as sort of a base for the very beginnings of the ideas for the artwork for the game, and you can really tell it has a very Asian feel. Final Fantasy kind of stood out. It's very Japanese, the Final Fantasy series, but it always had that sort of knights and dragons and warriors sort of European style setting, and the world of Spira in 10 has a much more Asian feel. I really loved that. I loved the music. The love story was actually believable. That's one thing that a lot of mainstream RPGs tend to do poorly, is a love story. It tends to feel forced. And this one, it doesn't. It's very believable. It's a great love story. It has a very happy, sad ending. Absolutely fantastic game. Something that I've always treasured, something that I still play. There are a few issues that... they're issues, but they're also kind of good things. The way they made the world is, instead of having a typical world map where you go around and it's sort of this like asymmetrical world with icons almost for different places, and you go into the icon and then you're into the actual place. Instead, in 10, it's the first one where you have one cohesive world to scale, that you're going from area to area, and until you get the airship you can't really just pick and choose and travel. And that's very good for making it feel like more of like a whole cohesive world, and it's good as far as storytelling because it constantly propels you forward, and you still have chances to stop along the way and do side quests, but it still shows you that the main story is the main drive. The problem with that is it is a little more linear, so pluses and negatives, and I've come to like that as far as it gives it a lot more replayability, because if you just want to do the main story, it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit of an easier Final Fantasy, and in that way it's actually the one I suggest to people. If you've never played a game in this series, it's probably the best starter Final Fantasy. Definitely not the best Final Fantasy, not even close, but probably the best starter one. And it's absolutely a fantastic game. It's nearly flawless, just a few little problems, like I said, like linearity, and a couple of the voice actors. Some of them are fantastic, like Lulu and Auron. Perfect, but a little bit of a mixed bag. Fantastic game. And because I was so in love with it, I was really excited for 10 too. Because if you're not familiar with the series, each volume of the series, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, going on forever, is a separate entity. It's a complete new story, complete new world. The only thing they share in common is certain elements, like chocobos and moogles and different types of summons and names of spells and names of things. There are a lot of elements in common, but they're very different individual titles. There's never been, before this, a direct sequel to a Final Fantasy. There's been spin-offs of some things, but there's never been a direct sequel. That's why it's 10-2, because you have Final Fantasy 10, and then Final Fantasy 11 was the online game, the first MMO for the series, a completely separate thing. This was 10-2, a direct sequel. And because Final Fantasy X was such a great game, it was a huge game, at the time it was their biggest project ever. It was, in 2006, Famitsu, the big Japanese gaming magazine, rated it the #1 game of all time. I think it was over 2,000 or 3,000 readers voted. It was a big thing. It was a great game, and this was going to be a huge deal. I was excited. I got it pretty soon after launch, I believe, initially, and I normally don't buy games right when they come out, so for me to get this within a couple months of it coming out was a big deal, and I was disappointed, very disappointed. Just from the opening, it has this very J-pop, but not in the like, oh, this is fun, goofy J-pop, more in the, wow, this is really kind of annoying, bubbly popcorn, mainstream crap J-pop sound to it, and it didn't fit, and it kind of reminded me of, they had this Charlie's Angels thing going on, because you were the three main, like, a female protagonists, and I was kind of excited seeing the cover, like, oh, it's cool, it's going to be an all-female cast, this is something different for Final Fantasy, and that'll be really interesting, and, there's this new character in the bottom, but it was terrible. They have them, come out and just have this Charlie's Angels stance, and they're treasure hunting pop stars, basically, and just, ugh. But I could get past that. I was like, all right, the basic premise is a little ridiculous, but then you get into it, and they absolutely ruined Yuna, the main character. She was one of the greatest characters ever in Final Fantasy X, and she was just this, not sure of herself. She was quiet, reserved, grew out of her shell in a realistic way, and here they make her this incredibly confident pop star who's like, instead of being a summoner, she's this gun-wielding, jumping around, like, it's ridiculous. It doesn't fit her character at all. It's not a realistic progression of the character, and that's what it's odd about the storytelling, is that in 10, they did a perfect job of growing a character realistically. That's so important. Changing your character is a great thing. It's good to see your character grow, but you have to do it in a way that makes sense. It has to be logical, and that's not with Yuna. They destroyed her character, like, completely in this one. It's horrible, horrible writing. Strangely enough, Riku is perfectly fine, and I think part of that just kind of fell into place because her goofy, kind of bouncing, way too hyper attitude fits a little bit more in the change of tone and style for 10-2, so they didn't really have to alter her character to fit her in, whereas they kind of had to force her character to fit into this new style of game they wanted to create. And then you have Pain, the new third character on the bottom here, who I really wanted to like her because I like that dark, gothy look for female characters. I love a tough, like, sword-wielding fighter female character. It's just I like that character type. But she was really just shoved in there as a replacement for, like, Auron or Cloud, or she really just was that character type to flesh out the trio. Instead of being a character who happened to be that style of character, she was that character style first, who was then given a personality. And this is just a terrible way to go about it. It's completely backwards, and it really just made her not the likable character she should have been. She was just very forgettable. And even more so, you get into it actually has a really good story after a while, particularly towards the end of the game, and it becomes really fitting. But there are elements about the world in which the story takes place in the first, quarter of the story as a whole that are atrocious. I mean, they're horrendous. There are things that the whole game, in all honesty, if I were to compare it to books, it would be like fan fiction. That's what it would be like. It doesn't feel like an actual, true sequel. It feels like published fan fiction given a multi-million-dollar budget. That's what it feels like. And the world, without giving anything away, if you haven't played Final Fantasy X, their entire belief system is challenged and changed in 10, and the world goes through this thing where they realize that everything they thought was truth, both from a religious perspective, both from just daily life, from everything that their history, everything that they thought was turned upside down, and the whole world changed, and the complete ruling structure, this whole religious network that was controlling the entire culture, tied every individual culture together, crumbled, and it was just massive changes towards the end. And this takes place only 2 years later, and somehow the world is perfectly fine, and we're like, oh yeah, we were so silly in the past. And they're going around to these places that were just sacred areas where major things happened in Final Fantasy X, and some of them they turned into like amusement parks, so they're giving people tours and like, ha ha ha, remember when we believed in the spirits that lived here? Remember when we believed this? That was so funny, we were so silly. Everything's happy now, the world has changed, and no. If you had a situation where just somehow you had just like complete irrefutable proof that every religion ever is completely false, and everyone came to realize it, and everything just like crumbled. You had like the Vatican was burned to the ground, and just the entire church network crumbled, and there's just a big shift of the entire belief system of the major societies of the world. There would be chaos. Eventually things would, calm down. There would be some new sense of order, but you don't get that in 2 years. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be people that still believe the old ways no matter how much you prove one way or the other. It's not going to work. And there's a little bit of this, as in like certain groups, but not in a significant way. And the overall tone and feeling of this is colorful and joyous and upbeat, and it doesn't make any sense. It's not well written at all. And I have such conflicting feelings about it, though, because every single complaint that I have, if you really think about it, is because I was such a fan of Final Fantasy X. But if you had never played Final Fantasy X, you knew nothing about it, you knew nothing about the story, you don't know what happened to the world, you don't know anything about the characters, you would have no problems at all with X-2. X-2, like every single issue, I mean, graphically, it's fantastic. They actually have, what's called the dress sphere system, which sounds ridiculous because you're like changing clothes in the middle of battle, like magically. You're not like taking stuff off and putting it on, taking 5 minutes. It's just this magical sort of like think of Sailor Moon, changing into Sailor Venus, Sailor Mercury, and like changing the clothes and whatever. And that's kind of what it's like, and it seems kind of silly, but it's actually really cool because you're changing the traditional job classes on the fly. They even add like a gunslinger class, and they're really, really interesting. It's really done well with just using these 3 characters. So everything from a technical perspective is great. Everything story-wise and character-wise is really good if you knew nothing going into it. And because it only somewhat ties into 10, I mean, if you'd never played 10, story would still make sense, especially if you don't get 100% and unlock everything. A lot of the story that you're getting would still make sense. They tell enough backstory. So it's a weird thing where Final Fantasy X-2 is not a bad game. It's actually a really good game, but it's a really terrible sequel, and it lives in this sort of weird area where how do you rate something like that? How do you what are your opinions on something like that? I'm really always conflicted because it's a good game, but there's so many things I just hate about it. It shouldn't have existed, but I've played it, and I've played it multiple times because it's not, I don't know, I have a weird relationship with this game. But yeah, so that's sort of my thoughts on Final Fantasy X and X-2. I absolutely love these games. Like I said, 10 is probably the best starter RPG, but the problem with that being is if you start with 10, you're probably not going to like X-2, but if you start X-2, it's going to ruin the story of Final Fantasy X. So, do what you want. But yeah, definitely must play Final Fantasy X. And in all honesty, X-2 is a must play if you have played 10 because there are some good story elements towards the end of the game. You do get a lot of questions answered about 10 that you still had. It's worth suffering through the bad to get to the good. It really is. Particularly since it's, they print millions upon millions of copies of Final Fantasy, so they're easy to find, they're super cheap. And at some point I'll talk about, they recently did an HD re-release of Final Fantasy X and X-2 for PS3 and the Vita, which you can buy individually or you can buy as like a dual pack of both of them together. And there are some changes. Once I get my hands on playing like the Vita version or whatever, I'll talk about it, because I realize there's a lot of changes to it as far as music, but they didn't really add as much as they should have. Technically, they're just the international versions that Japan got later, but that's for another time. But yeah, those are sort of just my basic thoughts and memories on Final Fantasy X and X-2. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed these games. If you have played them before, let me know below what your thoughts are. If if your opinion differs on X-2, no, but they did destroy Yuna's character. That is like factual. That's not even an opinion. Just no. That's just bad writing. Anyway, yeah. See you next time.